Hey everyone, welcome to the Thing About Wildlife.
I am Ishika.
And I'm Akshay. We are partnering with the Biodiversity Collaborative to bring to you a three-part series around biodiversity, society, and sustainable development in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands.
Human well being is inextricably linked with nature. The Biodiversity Collaborative is a nationwide effort to remind every Indian of this fact and bring biodiversity back into the center of each of our lives.
This initiative was catalyzed and supported by the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India and is currently being supported by Rohini Nilekani Philanthropies.
The Andaman Islands and Nicobar Islands are two separate archipelagos in the Indian Ocean, united politically as a union territory. But geography does not reflect its polity. The capital Port Blair is more than 1,600 kilometers from any point on mainland India. The northern tip of the Andaman Archipelago, on the other hand, is only 220 kilometers from Myanmar, while Great Nicobar, the furthest bit of Indian territory, is only 140 kilometers from Indonesia.
The archipelago is politically Indian, but its biodiversity is far from it. Plants and animals in this distant archipelago are more similar to those in Thailand, Myanmar, and Indonesia than the rest of mainland India.
This is the first episode in a three-part series on the Andaman and Nicobar Islands: isolation and flux. Let's unpack this phrase for a moment.
Isolation. Islands across the world are unique ecosystems, cut off from large land masses by salty, deep waters. Here, many plants and animals have evolved into creatures found nowhere else on Earth, and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands are no exception to this. Over 80% of the islands are carpeted in thick forest, and nearly all islands are lined with spectacular coral reefs and seagrass meadows. Within these forests and reefs are birds, insects, fish, and invertebrates, many of which found nowhere else on Earth.
But isolation is also the story of human cultures in the region, and human cultures go all the way back in time. Indigenous communities have probably lived on the Andaman Islands for over 20,000 years. But these archipelagos have always been in a state of flux, change.
Isolated human cultures were violently disrupted during our lengthy colonial period, when, for over 150 years, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands were part of Britain's India. Many indigenous human cultures were wiped out, and only communities most hostile to outsiders managed to survive.
The biodiversity also experienced massive change. A lot of forests were selectively logged for timber, and artisanal fisheries expanded into commercial fishing. Many species from mainland India were brought over, and some of those went rogue and outcompeted indigenous biodiversity, changing the landscape forever.
But the ebb and flow of human societies did not end with India's independence. Pre independent settlers in the region, like the Mapila people from the North Malabar and Karen people from Myanmar, were joined by various Adivasi communities from Chhattisgarh, Orissa, and Jharkhand. Collectively, these people are known as the Ranchis, and all of them came to work the forests for its timber. Fishing communities from Andhra Pradesh's northern coasts were encouraged to expand fisheries, and after the Bangladesh War of Independence, refugees from what was then East Pakistan were settled in northern and southern Andaman Islands.
The flux of people in Nicobars is even more riveting. Indigenous Nicobari and Shompen communities were joined by people from Andamans moving south.
This includes a sizable influx of Punjabi families in Great Nicobar who are descendants of freedom fighters locked up in cellular jail before India's independence.
In today's episode, you'll be listening to our guests unpack what is unique about the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, its biodiversity, and its people. Our guests are three researchers from mainland India who have worked closely with people and nature in the islands.
Our first guest is Manish Chandi, an affiliate with the Andaman and Nicobar Environment Team and Nature Conservation Foundation. In the last 25 years, Manish has worked on a wide range of projects in the region: herpetological surveys, forest restoration, and anthropology. For his PhD, he lived with the Nicobarese people, studying community sharing mechanisms and how they were disrupted by the 2004 tsunami.
Welcome, Manish.
Hi, both of you, Ishika and Akshay.
Our next guest is Madhuri Ramesh, a faculty member at the School of Development at Azim Premji University. Madhuri has worked in deserts, rainforests, coasts, and islands, and she's a herpetologist who turned to political ecology for her PhD and later work. Her research in the Andaman Islands focuses on nature-society relations and the consequences of these negotiations for conservation and sustainability. Thanks for joining us, Madhuri.
Hi, Akshay and Ishika. It's fun to be here and I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Shiba Desor is a social scientist who worked with the Karen community to set up the Andaman Karen Crafts Initiative, a cooperative to promote cultural continuity and environmental conservation through weaving, artisanal crafts, tree nurseries, and a local cuisine restaurant. Shiba has previously worked with forest rights policies and livelihoods. Welcome to the Thing About Wildlife, Shiba.
Thanks, Ishika. It's my pleasure being here.
Let's start with you, Madhuri. The Andaman and Nicobar Islands are far, far away. How do mainlanders see the Andaman and Nicobar Islands? There is so much history to that region that mainland Indians don't know about, right?
I think the first part of the question is the easy one. I think most people on the mainland think of the islands as this very densely forested place with a few world-class tourism hotspots. I think that about sums it, right? If either they say, oh, it's full of forests and coral reefs, or they say, oh, I went to Havelock on a holiday. And that's pretty much a summary of how the islands are seen. But yeah, obviously there's a lot more to that area than these two comments about it. And yeah, this is something that I often hear when I'm back here and I'm trying to explain to people what's interesting about the Andamans or what my work there is. First of all, they're surprised at this long history of the government settling different groups of people there in the islands and the kind of development promises or lures that were offered. And then ecologically also it's very interesting because in spite of its huge forest cover, I think over 90%, it's also a very long history of working the forest for timber and for various other things, right? So this is again something we still do. We just start with this dense forest cover kind of comment in all our ecology papers. But the truth is that forest cover is not, untouched or whatever. There are proper, felling coupes and afforestation plans and all going back to 100 years old. So that makes it a very interesting landscape. The other element, I think, to the whole mix is, this aspect of international trade. It's not something new, and it's been there for a very long time. Like you have the Chola Kingdom records talking about going to the Nicobars, and then you have all these Malay and Chinese traders talking about dealing in sea cucumbers and whatnot in the island, in the Andamans, at least in the 1800s and probably even a bit earlier. So a very networked place. And I think these are probably aspects of the islands that mainlanders really need to hear more about.
What about you, Manish? What do you think is the mainland gaze of the islands? Where are we now? Have we reached a place where Andaman and Nicobar Islands are part of the mainland consciousness? The tsunami brought the islands back into mainland consciousness for a while, but has the understanding of the islands changed, or have we failed at putting the islands front and center? What do you think?
See, at one level, it is nothing much has changed. At one level, where, like you've pointed out and said, yes, most people on the mainland, a large section of society in the mainland, virtually has no clue about the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, just probably heard about it. And they've heard about the cellular jail because of all the hoopla that's kind of gone behind the jail and so on and so forth. But even having said that, at the same time, there is a huge amount of interest amongst a much smaller section of society, especially people who are interested in natural history, conservation of nature, and so on, where people are like you and me and people like us are aware of the islands as a biological a hotspot of biological diversity. They know of it. They become aware of it. And for me, for instance, when I went out in '95, I mean, I was clueless about it virtually, to be very honest. I was really, really clueless. And there wasn't very much information about it at all. Very few people had knew about it. They just knew what was there on the map somewhere, or they'd heard about it, if at all, but nothing more. But that's changed. So for the mainland and the rest of us who have, people who have worked over there or who are from there and who have worked there has been a fair amount of writing and kind of webinars are happening about the place occasionally. People are being better informed. There are a couple of people who actually write a lot about the Andaman, for instance. They write and bring it into the media, and people are able to read about these the issues that confront the islanders and so on. There are very few journalists or people of that kind of caliber within the island, and I think that has to change. Or, I mean, where we should be able to kind of bring or push in a lot more effort, or and it has always been the case at some level of saying awareness and education for the islanders is and I really have seen that that's probably the most important aspect that one should work on is vis-a-vis long-term conservation for the islands, because there actually are a whole bunch of people who are interested, but they're very clueless, they haven't been able to be clued in. And I was, as an outsider, very lucky to have gone across to all those places that I'd gone. My colleague and friend John, who's from the islands, he himself had never traveled to half those places for about 10 years. Only later on, when we brought him into the boat and said, "Chalo, you also come along." He went to Little Andaman for the first time in his life, probably when he was 28 or 30 years old, probably, and so on. So, and there are people who haven't even gone to the Nicobar Islands. They kind of talk about it in the same breath. They don't know who the Nicobari is or who the Nicobaris are, the diversity of communities that are there. There are lots that has to change within the island. So of bringing, and there was, I mean, from Island, there's been a push and an effort which has not succeeded of bringing about a local book on geography and history of the islands, which should be part of the curriculum for the islands. Try to work with the Department of Education, the NCERT syllabus, and so on. Thing there is a great need to kind of bring about that sort of change for people, for the students of the islands, to learn and understand about their own islands. It is so important. In fact, I had an experience of this sort when I was on one of my ship journeys back to Port Blair. I happened to be, we were all kind of standing alongside on the deck, and there was this man with a long goatee sitting on the top deck. I was also there, actually, hanging out on top. And there were some guys asking about what is this island, what is that island, who's this, where is this, what is. There are people from the Andamans. So I was pointing out and telling them, look, this is Tiranchang, or that is Chaura, and so on and so forth. And then this man asked me, who are you? What are you talking about? Who are you? Where are you from? And I asked him, who are you? So he happened to be a man called Mr. Yamin Murtaza. And he was the executive engineer of the electricity department, a local born person, the elder brother of Arif Mustafa, who was with the fisheries department. And he was the executive engineer on his last few postings, or he was going back. He'd come on a small project to look at in southern Nicobar. And we got talking. And he told me, look, when we were kids in pre-independence as well, there used to be the small book on geography of the islands. These children, these people who are there in the present day and age don't have that. And he said, I said, do you have a copy of that book? He said, yeah, somewhere in our house there's a copy of that book lying around. So I went to his house, got a photocopy of that book. It was written in Urdu. It was originally published in 1935, I think. And it was used in the early 40s, late 40s as well. It had a small bit about Rangat. It had a small bit about Mayabandar. Where are the streams? Which are the big rivers? Which are the tall mountain peaks? Whether they were anglicized names or Andamanese names was not the issue. But the fact was that these people are being taught, at least the students, about their own islands, which present day Andaman Islanders don't have. They haven't had it for the past 20, 30 years. or more, 40 years, I would say, people haven't been taught about their islands. I think it's of paramount importance. Of course, people on the mainland should or also need to be made aware of. A lot more people can be and or are already aware, and there are lots of people who are concerned and supportive of means or methods of looking at more sustainable avenues of developing the Andamans. At the same time, I go back to the local community and local populace, of being able to strengthen them, to be able to kind of strengthen them and being able for them to understand their own islands better, to know the diversity that exists, to know the, I mean, we normally look at our plate of food and say, yours is better than mine, but actually ours is actually quite good. It's exactly something like that, saying that the islands themselves are so diverse. You and I know that because we've been there and spent some time and we see from an outsider's perspective, from an outsider's lens. Whereas the people from within, not always are they able to see that for themselves. So being able to teach them, and the government, I mean, we try to even kind of infuse this thought within the local government as well. It has taken a long time. I know people who have worked on it for a long time. They have tried really hard to infuse this idea with little success because of governmentality systems that are there. I think one of the critical things for the islands is for that to change, for the education system to incorporate an education system means for educating the students of their own islands about their own islands. Actually, it doesn't have to be any hi-fi science or geography or ecology. Simple stuff from which students can kind of then move on and pursue it if they're really interested and kind of find it of interest and so on. But to have that basic information and knowledge about their own background, their own islands is so important. A sense of ownership and a sense of responsibility that also comes from there as well, I would imagine.
Thanks, Manish. That's a really important insight about awareness even among islanders about their own region. Let's move to you, Shiba.
When you began working with communities in mainland India with Kalpavriksh, and you spent some time doing that. And then, like you said, you eventually found your way to the islands, which are a very different kind of system. And of course, these are different kinds of work, but there'll also, I'm sure, be a few similarities. So tell us a little bit about that professional journey for you. How was that transition going from working on mainland India to working in the islands? How different or similar was it?
I think, yeah, like in India also, in the mainland, I had two different kinds of experiences. One was this experience with Kalpurish, where there was a more um, wider engagement with networks and coordination, advocacy, and fieldwork, reports, organizing meetings. And then there was also just locating myself in with one women's collective and doing work with them in the mountains. And so in some ways the Andamans was a lot like the mountains experience, because there are some similarities in that way, in terms of the community having a sense of solidarity amongst each other and helping each other out, small, close knit, those sort of things. And but just like more generally, the difference between mainland and Andamans, in some ways, in the mainland, most indigenous communities, the way the relationship they have with other communities, non-indigenous communities, or like non-Adivasi communities, is different, I think, compared to the indigenous communities in Andamans. And in some ways, the indigenous communities in Andamans are have had a very different history of how the relationship between them has been managed by the government in some ways. So that is one difference. That's a big difference, and there would be many differences, and people have written about it. But like, just as a researcher and like an organization worker there, an NGO worker there, I think that both of you would also agree that that Andamans can be an isolating experience of research. And so the community of researchers, the network of researchers, is close knit, and they do give each other strength. So those moments where you come together, or like when you're away from the feedback in a research based center, those are more valued. And even small things like playing Ludo, or having chats over food, those become very valued, because you become a community of your own. So I think that was something that I did feel, that in the mainland you do not really value other um, researchers or NGO workers that much, because there are so many of them. Like there are still like you have access to them so much more, whereas there the access, the connection, the connectivity, all of that makes those experiences of coming together more in some ways precious.
Madhuri, you mentioned something very interesting about an old multicultural history of the Andaman Islands, especially trade. Can you share this history with our listeners? This is tied to the nature of the place too, correct?
Yeah, the islands are very interesting. I've never been to the Nicobar, so anything I say has to do only with the Andamans. I find it very fascinating that they have such a multicultural history and also a very old trade history. Because this again completely overturns the typical way in which we write about biodiverse landscapes, right? As remote, untouched, blah, blah, blah. But then you hear that, I mean, you read at least about these fantastic historical accounts about the Andaman Islands and, centuries of people stopping by to trade and see cucumbers and troca shells and whatnot, and all these British efforts to try and create a settlement there. Yeah, so it's historically and socially a very interesting place because of these kinds of connections to the larger world. And for me, it was also very interesting because there's a strong post-colonial thread that connects the Andamans to other parts of Southeast Asia. It was one of the Strait Island settlement groups. So I think the other counterparts were Singapore, Penang, Kuching, these other places as well. They're sort of contemporary to Port Blair. But yeah, they're so different again. I think Singapore is similar in the sense of its social makeup when you compare it to the Andamans. But yes, economically it's very different. And one huge point I would like to mention here is that Singapore does not grow any food, which is why it's so industrialized. Whereas that's not the case in the Andamans. It's still quite agrarian, and therefore not very industrialized. So the trajectories have been very different, and I think that makes it interesting also. Yeah, so this sense of history to the islands is a very attractive feature for me personally to work on them. And from the beginning, people have sort of made homes in the Andamans from living off nature, right? So whether you look at the indigenous communities or you look at the settler communities, this relationship to the land has been very critical because it was quite a far-flung place and there were very limited options for communities to sustain themselves. So I think there's also this long history of transformation of nature and how that has driven social and economic development in particular ways.
That's very interesting, Madhuri. There is this deep and complicated and old history, yes, but maybe the opposite is also true, that settlement is so recent and their cultures are an amalgamation of traditional knowledge systems from mainland and what people are encountering in the islands. For instance, the names of plants in erstwhile Bangladesh, or say Chhattisgarh, Orissa, or Jharkhand, are being applied to very different species that are not South Asian, but in fact Indo-Burman, right? The species that they encounter. And this matching of species is based on external form and its functional utility for people. Is this something your work looks at? Say the genesis of knowledge systems and histories?
Well, that's fascinating because I think I've heard a couple of the biology people mention this, that they have these disconcerting habit of using local names from the mainland or to completely different species in the Andamans. And unless you are a biologist, you would not even realize what was going on, right? Because these are familiar names in the mainland. And only if you are a biologist, you realize that, hey, these are different species, probably even different genera, and why are these people using those names? But yeah, there seems to be this huge element of nostalgia coming into the making of local knowledge here, which is something that's very interesting. And no, I mean, I really want to look at it more closely, but I've just not gotten around to doing it in any systematic way. But you're so right, Akshay, that this is a very fascinating aspect of ecological knowledge of India. And it's also, like you're saying, knowledge that is historically speaking quite nascent and quite new. I mean, 50, 60 years of settlement is not that old as compared to the mainland. Yeah. Right. I was just also going to say that there seems to be more fluidity here between communities, because some of the, Ranchi or the around, I mean, Ranchi itself is a very general category. Let's say the Orao, Munda, and some other group, they're all sort of mixing and matching names from each other's traditional systems here. There's a fair bit of give and take. And similarly, the Telugu and the Bengali and the Tamil fishermen all seem to be swapping names with each other as well when it comes to fish. So this is a more fluid landscape, and yeah, it's something we should all study better. This idea of local knowledge in transplanted populations, transplanted human communities.
Shiba, could you tell us a little more about the work that you did in the Andaman Islands? Because the Karen community you work with are neither indigenous per se, but they don't trace their origins to what is politically India now. So could you talk to us about that, their sense of place, and how you saw yourself fitting into that space?
So I was working there with the Karen community, and this is a group of people that were brought in from Burma, which is now Myanmar, to the Andamans in 1920s. And there's still a bit of a not exact agreement on why they were brought. Like some people say that they were asking for a place, and others say that it was because the government wanted forest laborers. I think it was somewhere in between, that the government was looking at settlement programs, and then there was also just like a serendipitous connection between the reverend and the person who was managing here, and so it came about that they were brought in. And in 1920s, I think it was the chief commissioner or something of the chief commissioner of Andamans and his relative, the Reverend Marshall. So they had correspondence in between themselves, that there's a group of people who are landless and who are good Christians and who are seeking land, and so maybe they can be settled here. And so that was one of the first communications that brought about this settlement. And then what happened was that now we have about 3,000 of these people still living in Andamans, and there is still a Karen community in Burma, there is in Thailand, and all over the world there is diaspora. But in Andamans, it is, as you said, a mix of a settler and an indigenous community, because they were an indigenous community where they were. They did have very strong connections with land in terms of how they got their livelihood and the sea. And so they're good at fishing, hunting, foraging, farming also. They were shifting cultivators. And those connections are still in some ways existing in the present time. Their cuisine is different. They still depend upon medicinal plants. They still have a lot of uncultivated food substances in their diet. So those connections are still there. They are really good craftsmen of wood, bamboo, cane. But at the same time, Andamans as a space is changing, and it has been changing, and their sources of livelihood are very limited at present. And so there had been conversations about it between some people of the current community and the research center ANET, for many years. And this project had evolved from those conversations. So in some ways I was attracted to the project because Karen people, and especially one Karen person, Sojo Nongthong, was very centrally involved with this project. And I didn't want to be involved in a project that was just a creation of either mainlanders or people who were not really from the place. But since this was something that had emerged from the place, based on participatory surveys, and was going to have a continued, very active involvement of one current person, I was interested in this project, which involved exploring possibilities of livelihood that would use bamboo, cane, would use the traditional crafts and the traditional cuisine, and look at ways of restoring those as a source of livelihood rather than the other methods of mainstream livelihoods. So it felt like an interesting opportunity to learn, and to engage, and to work together with people.
That's really interesting, Shiba, especially how grounded your work was in working with people while still being in the background in some sense. So, Manish, we want to take you back a couple of decades. You were part of some really exciting surveys for saltwater crocodiles or salties at that time, right? Could you share with our listeners what that was like?
So we would start our dinghy from North Vandoor, pack in dal, rice, tea, sugar, salt, whatever chilies, green chilies, and potatoes and onions, and sail out. We would sail out past the Jarawa Reserve all the way up to north, start looking at the beaches from beyond there to look for sea turtle tracks and look and kind of confirm what Satish Bhaskar had initially surveyed many years before us. At the same time, we would also take our little dinghy and the inflatable town through mangrove creeks to look for salties, try and do a small kind of salty census. And we were seeing immense amount of wildlife. You would bump into poachers, fellows harvesting all kinds of materials from the forests around there, including hunting of wild boar, venison, whatever else, everything. We were seeing people in action, people doing what they were normally doing. And it was not playing hide and seek. The only people who used to play hide and seek were the Burmese poachers. So we encountered them as well. So it was all very, very thrilling, very exciting kind of set of years when all of these things were we were discovering it on the go virtually.
We've come to the end of episode 1, but there is so much more to talk about. In our next episode, Livelihood and Adaptability, we'll be taking a deep dive into people and their relationships with nature in the region. Shiba, Madhuri, and Manish will join us again, dive deep into a treasure trove of memories, experiences, and stories to paint a much better picture of what it is like to live in this far little corner of a very different India.
The only constant is change, and the archipelago epitomizes that. Overlay this constant flux on an isolated, unique ecosystem, and you end up with a dizzying variety that our guest spoke about today.
Join us next time for Livelihoods and Adaptability.
From the Thing About Wildlife and the Biodiversity Collaborative, thanks for listening.